Motivation, motivation, motivation. In our society, we're so enamored with motivation, but the problem is we don't actually do it right. And I think it's because most of us don't understand what motivation is and how motivation actually demotivates us and makes the things that we're trying to get motivated for harder to do. In this video, I'm going to teach you the 7 keys to true, sustainable, and long-lasting motivation so that you can set yourself up to achieve every single one of your goals. And if you're a coach, you're dealing with this stuff all day long with every single one of your clients. So you have to teach them how to break motivation down and implement it in their lives. Hey, everybody. In this episode, we're going to talk about motivation. Motivation is a worn out topic. I don't think I've ever said it that way. It's a worn out topic because I think it's, you okay over there, Michelle? All right. It's a worn out, it's a worn out topic because we talk about it all the time, but I think it's a watered down topic at the same time because I don't think we talk about it properly, or I don't think we really understand it properly. And I think that's why so many people have a challenge with motivation. You know, we talk about the need to be motivated, and we do affirmations, and we do all these things in the personal development world to try to keep our motivation up. And so we're going to dive into this and dissect it as we do. And with this episode, we've got Michelle Moore on the line, and she's our head coach here in our company. And she's been really studying motivation and personal development and all things human behavior for a long, long time, as well as gone through a lot of her own journey, bouts with motivation and challenges and all the things that we go to. So I'll turn it over to you first, and you can kind of tee us up here about, you know, what motivation is or what you think it is, and we'll see where it goes.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation with you and just be a part of what you're creating. I have a love-hate relationship with motivation. One of the very first things that I learned when I got into the direct sales world back, man, it must have been in like 2006, 2007, I learned that I could control my thoughts. And one of the ways that I learned to do that was through this motivational CD that I would listen to every single morning. And it started out for me where it was less about like using motivation to change my thoughts, and more about using motivation to drown out the thoughts that were already in my head. And
That's
so
what they said the purpose of the CD?
No, that's what I used it
Okay.
for. No, it was not something that they said. It was about, like, you know, planting seeds and learning how to create new thoughts. But for me, like, the first step was to just turn up the volume louder, right? Have something playing louder than my own internal dialogue.
Then all the demotivation.
And this probably won't surprise you, but I like burned out the CD. I had to get a new one.
Oh, like literally, you ruined it?
I literally ruined it. It was
Nice.
called Abundance Mentality. It was great, and it really made a huge difference for me. So I love motivation from that way, like where it can inspire action, and it would be something that I would get pumped up about. And it was something that I would started to learn to listen to. I found like videos, right? Little motivational clips on YouTube, short videos that I could get excited about, things that would get me fired up. But what I started using them for was to push myself to take action on things that I didn't really want to do.
Okay.
Yeah, so over time it started to feel a little bit hypey and kind of shallow. So I know that the dictionary, right, at least online, defines motivation as the reason or reasons that one has for acting or behaving in a particular way. And when I read that, I thought, well, that kind of seems pretty broad and overgeneralizing, especially considering all the things that you teach about like the human brain and what motivates us to take action. So how do you, Sean, define motivation?
Well, there's a lot to dive in just what you said. So before I answer that question, the idea that you were essentially kind of motivating your demotivation out, I think that's a really important concept to understand, because I think that's where a lot of people, or what a lot of people fall into. And I know one of the things that you teach is being not sad is not the same as happy. You know, the concept of numbing our negative emotions, that actually doesn't produce the positive emotion. And I don't think I've thought it, oh, I know I haven't thought about motivation in this way. That if motivation is essentially just the replacement of the negative thoughts, drowning out the negative thoughts, that's not actually the point of motivation. You know, if you go back to the definition, if I remember what you said, like motivation is for us to behave a certain way, right? For us to take a certain action. I mean, if we're not taking an action, then whatever we're using for motivation isn't working, because the point is to be motivated, in air quotes, and then take an action. But a lot of people, I think, are using motivation as a numbing mechanism, and it's just numbing the negative thoughts out. And in that case, it's not actually leading to action. It's just simply drowning out all the negative things. And that's okay if that's where people are, right? So I don't want anybody to feel like shamed or anything like that. Nobody is doing that intentionally, but that's actually not the point. So we're not using whatever modes of motivation, whether it's a CD that you burn out or affirmations or a goal poster or whatever. If it's not producing the outcome, then it's not serving its purpose, right? So I think that is a really important thing to look at first, is this producing the outcome that I want? And I mean, how many times do you think you listen to that CD? Hundreds, if not thousands, if you burned it out.
Yeah.
So you listen to something hundreds and hundreds of times, and maybe you did this, maybe you didn't, but like at some point we got to check in, go and say, is this working? And knowing what I know about you, it probably worked to an extent, you know, like you still were doing a lot of the actions that you do. And I'm sure it didn't work in the sense that you kept having to listen to the CD over and over again. And I think that's what you were kind of alluding to when you mentioned kind of shallow and hypey. Like if we continue to need motivation, then the motivation isn't working. Assuming that we want to not need motivation all the time. So going back to your question, you know, I don't know that I have a definition of motivation. I'll just speak on it and maybe we'll pull a definition out. But the need for motivation is demotivating. And therefore the existence of motivation is demotivating. What I mean by that is we don't ever motivate ourselves to do things we want to do. So the very fact that we need motivation tells our brain we're not going to like this thing, therefore we need to be motivated to do it. So every time that we seek motivation, we are connecting the activity that we're trying to motivate ourselves into with discomfort or fear or just not going to like it, right? We're connecting it with something negative. That's why we need to be motivated. And so if we're trying to motivate ourselves towards something like building a business, you know, you mentioned direct sales. A lot of people are in direct sales. You got to make phone calls and you got to talk to a bunch of people and, you know, be outreach, you know, and if you're in business of any kind, you need outreach, whether you're doing emails or videos or blogs or whatever it is, you got to promote yourself and you have to market. You're going to have sales conversations. If you have to motivate yourself to do those things, you will always hold on to those things as stuff you don't want to do. And therefore, actually, it becomes not just cemented, but I think we create the opposite effect, meaning the more that we motivate ourselves to do something, the more we need it. It's kind of like what's the term with drugs? We lower our tolerance. Yeah. Tolerance level goes down. So, you know, you used to get high with a certain amount of a drug, and over the course of time, you need more and more and more of it. And it really is that way with motivation. It does kind of work like a drug. And the same level of motivation that you needed to make 5 phone calls a year ago is not going to be the same level of motivation that you need now to either make 5 phone calls or to make 50 phone calls as we evolve and we want to scale our business or scale our life. So we don't want motivation to be necessary. If we want motivation, if motivation continues to be necessary, we will always be emotionally unstable because motivation ends. There's no such thing in the way I'm talking about motivation, and we'll get into what I think the solution is here. There's no such thing as constant motivation because the energy of motivation is, I'm going to get all excited. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to do it right this time. I'm not going to succeed. I'm not going to fail. I'm going to succeed. I'm going to win.
No matter what.
No matter what. A lot of times we have, you know, the Rocky music playing in the background. We got all this high energy, and the human brain and the human body and the human being cannot sustain that motivation. It's literally like driving a car in first gear. At some point, the engine will burn out. If you go too fast and you don't shift, the engine's going to burn out. And so many people are burning themselves out with that high level of motivation. The problem is that it works over a short period of time. And so why would we change something that works? And the other problem is it's the common belief that this is what we need. So because it's in this like common belief system, you know, it's common in our language that we need to be motivated. There's no reason for a lot of us to challenge that. It's just like, apparently that's what we need because we hear about it all the time. And this is the way to get motivated. And you just got to stay there. But to my knowledge, no human has ever learned how to stay there because I don't think it's possible. And if they do, like I said, they'll literally burn out, and some of them will die, literally die. Their body will expire if they operate on that high level of stress. So motivation is actually more dangerous, I think, in the long run when it works, because then there's no reason for us to change it. This kind of motivation that we're talking about. So if we try to pull a definition out of that, I would say it's an ego-driven, short-term fuel for taking action that you don't want to take. That's a pretty good definition. I've never tried to define motivation, but
wow,
that's it. An ego-driven, short-term fuel to take an action you don't want to take. Yeah, there's a lot embedded in that definition, isn't there?
It doesn't feel good.
Right.
I'm like, wah, wah. I was like, let me go back to what the online dictionary said. That felt better.
Right, right. That feels way better. Yeah, because it feels okay. It feels right. It feels like that's what we should do. And I want to dive into the ego. You know, I don't think I mentioned ego until that definition. The reason it's an ego-driven fuel is because motivation in this sense is usually, and by usually, like almost all the time. And by almost, I mean all the time. It's used to satisfy the ego. It's used for us to win. It's used for us to get something, right? So we motivate ourselves to make phone calls so that we can get appointments, so that we can win and we can make money and we can feel better about ourselves. So this kind of hype-driven motivation is actually tapping into a fuel source, which is a valid fuel source, the ego, but it's not the strongest one, and it's not the most sustainable one. So if our ego is not the strongest and it's not the most sustainable, then we should not build a system based on it. We shouldn't build a system feeding it if it's not the best fuel source anyway, right? So we need to check in and see what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish. And when our ego wants to win, what that does is it lights up the conversation of winning. And the thing is, you can't think about winning without thinking about losing. And losing is where all of our fears are. So if we go into it's like going into the ego room, right? If we go into the ego room, we're entering the room that is actually where our biggest fears are. So even if we come up with a way to defeat those fears temporarily and get ourselves to take a few steps towards the actions that we don't want to take, that's not the best thing for us. And think of it also, if we understand that this is a short-term thing and it's based on the ego winning, then we're building this hamster wheel of sorts where we can get ourselves to take another trip around the hamster wheel and still not get very far when it comes to what our soul actually wants. And it's not what our ego wants. So we're finding ways to cement a habit that actually won't work on many levels. And if it does, that's even worse. So many people are addicted to this hamster wheel of ego-driven motivation, and they're not happy. It's because satisfying your ego can never create happiness. That's not where happiness is generated, through the satisfaction of our ego. So if we want to live a life of happiness, catering to our ego is not the way to do it.
Man. We're not even moving toward our purpose, right? Like you said, defeating our fears. We're not even defeating our fears, right? We're just like temporarily finding a way to circumvent them, right? Like, can I hop over them? Can I use this like what are they, like rocket boosters, right? Like the little, like the last push, right? To get through the atmosphere, like to do that, which is great, right? Like it's awesome to have a sprint in a marathon. It's awesome in a race, right? To have that, like, you know, next gear where you can like catapult forward for the short term. But to do that the whole entire time, I mean, that would be like running a sprint for an entire marathon. like you said earlier, I mean, the human body's not designed to do that.
Yeah, that's a great analogy to use. And the sprint and the marathon. And what you said at the beginning of that statement, I think is really critical, that we're actually not defeating our fears. We're just finding a way to overpower them temporarily. And the problem with that is they'll come back because we haven't removed them.
Yeah, they haven't gone anywhere.
And we're actually, over the long haul, strengthening them. And that's why we need to keep building up more and more motivation, right? Because of that tolerance concept. And so now we're just in a battle all the time of trying to overpower our fears, trying to get enough momentum to be able to run over, jump over the wall, or to be able to climb the hill. But as the hill gets steeper, or as the hill gets bigger, we need more and more motivation. And it's not sustainable. Yeah. So
what do we do?
Yeah, the opposite. Maybe not the opposite, but the other fuel source, let's say. And I'm glad you brought this up a moment ago. I really want to highlight this. This doesn't mean that motivation is entirely bad. It can be good, and like in the marathon analogy, it can be great to start off quick. You can use some energy maybe early, or you can use the energy when you do run up a hill, or you can use the energy when when you're about to finish, or somewhere along the line for a kick, right? You can use it strategically in certain places. And during that time, you might throw the Rocky music on and just bust it, right? Especially towards the end, because that once you cross the line, you can recharge for a few days. So motivation is not entirely bad. It's just not long-term sustainable, and it actually doesn't generate the kind of fuel that will drive us toward our purpose, as you said. So my word of that kind of fuel is inspiration. And if you break down inspiration, it's to inspire from within. I don't know if that's the actual definition, but it's to tap into something internal. And that's not going to be your ego. That's going to be your soul. That's going to be your heart. That's going to be your purpose for being, your purpose for living. And your purpose actually has a lot of inspiration inside of it, a lot of reason to act inside of it. It's just that it works differently, right? It doesn't work the same as motivation. And so if we are expecting our actions that are fueled by inspiration to look the same as actions that are fueled by motivation, we're always going to be disappointed, because they don't look the same. Inspiration is built for the marathon, and motivation is built for the 100-meter dash. So that's a big piece of managing our expectations. And so if we think that motivation is the way to drive the human to behaviors or changing habits, but we tap into our purpose and we're like, hey, I'm not all fired up here. I don't want to run through a wall like I did when I was listening to the Rocky music, or like my mentors do, or my leaders or my coaches, or the people that are teaching me that this is the way to go. If it doesn't look the way we expect it to look, then we usually decide that it's wrong. And so we stop. And a lot of people are doing the right thing, like they've really tapped into something that is inspiring, but they're judging it as being wrong because it's not motivating, at least in the same way that they understand motivation. So if we realize that these are two different fuels, they're both necessary, but one fuel is way better long-term, that fuel being inspiration, then we can manage, right? We can manage our judgments of them. We can manage our experience. We understand that fuel by inspiration looks different than fueled by motivation. And we can encourage ourselves better, you know, like we can be with ourselves along the journey in a much more empowering way than continually cracking the whip, which is the way that motivation works a lot. So inspiration is tapping into your fuel for living, really. It's not tied to winning. It's really tied to living, I would say. It's tied to an experience, not an accomplishment. Right? It's not tied to conquering something. And that's what motivation is. It's motivation is so that we can conquer the obstacle, whatever the obstacle is, whether it's fear or literally running up a hill or something like that. It's driven by the desire to conquer something. And inspiration is really driven by the desire to experience something. And that's where we get into, the idea of your purpose, right? What's the point? What's your reason for being?
I like what you said about experience. The word that came to my mind was embrace. Right? Because when I'm motivated or when I'm working, right, I used to teach like exercise classes and boot camps. And when I'm like pushing people, right, to go harder, go farther, keep going, it's like no matter what, right? Ignore anything that's telling you, turn that off. Like you can do it, just go, don't, like whatever's in your way, you're going to demolish, right? Conquer is the word that you used. But when we're moving from that place of inspiration, it's like any of the obstacles that come up, we're able to just experience them and embrace them and move like through them and have that be a beautiful part of the journey. I love that distinction, right? The two different fuels and really understanding that they don't operate in the same way. Man, I mean, I can think of so many times where I've judged myself as being lazy, right? Not like really wanting it bad enough when it's possible that I was operating out of inspiration and judging it through the lens of motivation.
Yeah. So you were actually doing it right and you decided that you were doing it wrong and created frustration or whatever you created. So I want to dive into one more thing that you brought up in this pattern of motivation, like just push through the pain, finish your exercise set, make it through the finish line, whatever that is. What it causes is a connection to the need to know the end. What I mean by that is, if we can literally see the finish line and we're running a race, we will have a lot more adrenaline that we can expend because we know we just have to push through these 50 yards or 100 yards. At the end of a diet, let's say, if we know we just got to do this cleanse for 24 more hours, it's easier to remind ourselves, just push through it, suck it up. It's going to end in 24 hours. And what that creates is an attachment to certainty, an attachment to knowing what the future is going to be, right? Knowing when this is going to end, knowing how it's going to end, knowing what the path ahead of us has in store for us. When we know that, then it's easier to empty the tank. Then it's easier to just go, because we know it's going to end in a moment here, and then we can recharge. But if you remove the finish line, we don't want to empty the tank. And part of that is just survival. The reason we don't want to empty the tank is because we might need that fuel in the tank if something comes up where we actually need it, right? And so we don't want to empty the tank if we don't see the finish line. So by plugging into this hamster wheel pattern of motivation, the way we're defining it, we are telling ourselves that we won't take action unless we know how and when this is going to end. But our purpose doesn't have an end like that. Our reason for being doesn't end next Tuesday. It doesn't end when we hit a certain number on the scale. But we're demanding that we can see the finish line before we empty the tank or before we really take this committed, motivated action. And this is another reason why catering to this motivational, like not just desire, but almost like a savage, like thirst or hunger, you know, like a craving. We then start to crave the finish line. And then we tell ourselves, if you'll tell me when this is going to end and you tell me exactly what it's going to look like and you tell me exactly who's going to say yes when I make the phone calls, if you can tell me exactly what I'm going to experience, then I'll be motivated. And now it's like we got this tug of war going on inside of ourselves. Our unconscious mind is saying, I will give you all of the fuel you need if you give me what I'm demanding, which is the need to know exactly how this is going to look only for the end, you know, to the end of time, right? Only for the rest of our lives.
In every area.
In every area. You know, I don't know how clear this is coming out of my mouth as it is in my head, but I really hope people get this point that we are creating not just a psychological, but we're actually creating a neurological addiction to needing to know the finish line and needing to know what the path looks like between where we are now and that finish line. And in life, that's just impossible.
Only in every area with all things, though.
That's it. Everywhere else, motivation is fine, right? But wherever humans are and uncertainty is, then it's not going to work. At least it's not going to work long term. You think about it, you know, I mentioned diets. I heard a study not too long ago that said the average person, I think, gains 1.5 pounds for every diet that they commit to.
Perfect.
Exactly. Right. And the sad thing is diets work generally when we're committed to them. And then we cross that finish line, whether it's we hit a number on the scale and then, you know, there's no reason to keep going because we've already hit our target, which is another thing we can dive into in a moment. Or I'm doing this for 10 days or I'm doing this through the summer or whatever it is that the end goal is. What'd you say?
When we're motivated.
Exactly. As soon as the motivation ends, either because it gets too difficult to keep going or we achieve the thing that we're motivated to achieve, then we fall off the wagon and we fall back to our habits. And since we no longer have motivation, nor do we have inspiration, we just fall back to our habits of eating the way we've always eaten. And pretty soon we'll be back to where we started the diet plus 1.5 pounds, right? Maybe a little bit more. For some people, it's plus 50 pounds. But the point is we just get this yo-yo experience where when we're motivated, we go. And when we're not motivated, we don't go. And then we fall back onto our patterns. And this idea of crossing a finish line with motivation, once that finish line is crossed, if you don't have inspiration to keep you going, then the only thing that happens is the motivation turns off. And that's why we just fall back, you know, into our patterns. And that's exhausting. I mean, it really, truly is exhausting. It's like, to use your running analogy, it's like running full speed until you literally cannot run anymore, and then falling to the ground and recovering until you have enough juice to run full speed again.
Right.
I don't know if this like study has actually been done, and I don't know how long people can literally run full speed until they fall. Of course, that's going to depend on conditioning, but you know, you imagine like the world's most conditioned athlete. I can't imagine them being able to run more than a few hundred meters full speed until their body shuts off. And then how long will it take them to recover? And then I think as they do it again and again and again, I don't know if their physical body will actually be able to shorten the recovery time, or if the recovery time lengthens. I guess that depends on some of the physical factors. But what I know to be true is the psychological recovery time, that's going to increase exponentially. Like, I don't want to do that again, because the mind remembers the breakdown. The mind remembers the pain and the body shutting off. And the mind doesn't like that. That's not fun. It's not fun for us to go until we're exhausted and then try to get back up. And so going back to what you said in the very beginning of this, most people's experience of motivation is not actually from neutral to motivated. It's from demotivated to neutral.
Right.
That's their experience of motivation. And man, I hope that really lands for anybody that's watching and listening to this. That is so incredibly profound to understand. We're just trying to get back to recovery mode rather than staying in forward momentum. And staying in momentum requires inspiration.
That's huge. That's so huge. Dang.
Yeah, this idea that motivation is really just going from empty to neutral, basically. I mean, it's really like going from negative empty, whatever that measurement is, right? Like total exhaustion back to empty.
Yeah.
And you know, a great analogy for this is, and I've felt this many times in business and various other places, where I feel like I just keep constantly being pulled under the water, and I'm caught in the undertow, and that undertow is exhausting, and I obviously can't breathe, and I only have a short amount of time to get some breath. And sometimes I'm disoriented and I don't know which way is up, and I'm trying to use the fuel that I have in my body, which is actually going in the wrong direction in that scenario. If we're talking about literally being in the undertow, and we start to panic, and really all I'm trying to do is get back to the surface of the water to take another gulp of air. And then as soon as I grab that gulp of air, I'm going to be pulled back down again. And then I just repeat the process. So for a lot of people, the experience of motivation is just going from undertow to gulp of air above the surface, and then pulling back down. And that's the experience of motivation, which is just constant exhaustion, right? I mean, you're just getting pounded constantly. Whereas inspiration is staying above water and actually learning how to swim, right? Not needing to get back from the undertow, because you're continually moving in action. And of course, now this goes back to what we were saying. There will be times when we do get pulled under, and that's the time that we use motivation to get back to the surface. But it's inspiration that's going to keep us driven to swim above the surface. Hopefully that analogy lands for other people, because it's really clear to me.
Yeah, it's I felt like sadness even when you were talking about the like the diet, right? And the recovery period, and just the thought that I had was the weight of shame and the beating up of myself for like being here again and being in this place again and not being able to use the fuel that's not designed for the purpose that I'm trying to use it for, like not being able to do it, right? Even though what I was trying to do is literally impossible. Like that's right.
That's it. It's just literally impossible. That's all. But
Literally
you can still do it.
I will
If
try.
you're motivated enough, you can still do it. Just do
Yeah.
the thing that's literally impossible for humans to do.
I mean, that distinction is so like significant in the motivation inspiration conversation. Like they're both important and they're both necessary, but it's imperative that we use them in the right way so that we don't judge ourselves for using them incorrectly and then cause ourselves to have to need more motivation to get us back to neutral, to then repeat the cycle again. No wonder we're exhausted. And so many of us don't actually make any progress towards our goal. We keep in that start, stop, get a little bit ahead, fall right back cycle.
What word did you use a moment ago? You said, did you say you felt sad, or you felt, it's the word that's coming to me right now as you just repeat all that back is just like hopeless, right? But it's important to understand that this is what's going on so that we can recognize that this isn't sustainable. And obviously, what can we do differently, right?
Right.
So if we take a look at what does drive us, right? I've mentioned the word drive a few times. And to me, this is really important to shift away from motivation to drive. And I think one of the reasons is because motivation has a positive connotation and drive doesn't. Drive is just neutral. Like like in a car, you can be driving forward or backwards. It's just what causes us to move. And sometimes what causes us to move is not healthy. And sometimes we can be motivated towards something that actually in the grand scheme of things is not healthy for us. And we're moving, but we're not making progress. Sometimes we're moving, just spinning the wheels in the mud. So if we remove the connotation of motivation and understand movement, then for me at least, and I think this is true for most people, at least that I've coached and had this conversation with, then it's a lot easier for us to assess. It's a lot easier for us to make decisions. It's a lot easier for us to be aware, as you were saying, like, am I moving right now, but maybe moving in the wrong direction? Or am I moving in a way that if I take a look at motivation, if I see this through the idea of motivation, this is actually a negative thing. But if I see this through the filter of inspiration or the filter of driving, this is actually a positive thing. And so I want us to be able to zoom back a little bit and take a look at ourselves like we're science projects almost, right? Like what causes this particular human being to act? And I just happen to be this particular human being. Or obviously in a coaching relationship, we can provide that awareness for our clients. We generally cannot provide it for ourselves because we just can't coach ourselves. But this is the understanding of and the study of drivers, not necessarily motivation. And what I teach is that there are 7 main drivers. And I don't know that they're like, I don't want anybody to listen to this and think that this is the only thing. And I'm really open to anything else that you think drives you, or if you have certain questions about or disagreements with some of the words that I use. I don't want to be caught up in splitting hairs, you know, around the exact words. I want you to catch the concept, and please, anybody that's watching or listening to this, add to it. You know, I want to hear more from you if you have things to add to the list. But what I teach and what I believe and what we teach in our certification programs that really drive a lot of our coaching philosophies is that there are 7 main drivers, and I'll just list them here and then kind of dive into each one of them a little bit more. So there are values, beliefs, identities, definitions, fears, habits, and experiences. Values, beliefs, identities, definitions, fears, habits, and experiences. And a lot of these work in conjunction with each other. So there's a lot of overlap in a lot of these. And some of them have, you know, different definitions. So again, don't be caught up so much in the wording here. But the idea is that these are below the surface, right? And motivation is generally above the surface. The motivation that we've been talking about is above the surface, right? We motivate ourselves to take the actions above the surface so that we can get the accomplishments above the surface, so that we can get the tangible rewards. Motivation is highly driven by tangible outcomes. And if you don't get the tangible outcomes, then it's very difficult to keep the motivation. Inspiration is intangible, it's below the surface. And so these elements are much more under the radar. You know, they're not measurable the same way that tangible motivation is measurable, right? Like we can tell when we've got a bunch of energy flowing through us and we want to run through a wall, or, you know, we want to run up those Philadelphia steps like Rocky, and, you know, we can really feel that. There's a level of measurement that we can say, oh, right now I'm motivated. And as we said, inspiration doesn't come with that same level of tangible measurement. So part of this process of becoming more self-aware and looking into our drivers is being willing to suspend our previous understanding of motivation and understanding of the result of motivation, so that we can dive a little bit deeper and really understand ourselves. So is there anything you want to say before I dive into each one of these?
Yeah. I just have this image of inspiration being like an anchor, right? On our boat. And that motivation is actually unproductive and dangerous if our anchor of inspiration isn't lifted. So if we don't have these 7 drivers, right, that you mentioned here and are going to dive deeper into, that even if we have that motivation, it's like we catapult forward, but we come right back because we haven't lifted up that inspiration. Man, well, I'm excited.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. And I think everybody can understand, whether you've been in a boat and tried to drive off with the anchor, or you've driving in a parking or in a car and your parking brake is on. You know, that level of like, something is causing me to not really be able to move here. And so as I think about and look at this list, what's important to understand is these are not yes or no concepts. Whereas motivation is a yes or no concept, right? Like you ask yourself, do I feel like going to the gym? Yes or no? And most of us, well, I don't know about most, but a lot of us at least, if the answer is no, then we don't go. If you don't feel like making phone calls, then you don't make phone calls. And so our action depends on those conditions being answered yes. But what your drivers are not yes and no. Your drivers are more of a concept to understand. And then the question is, Not whether or not they're influencing you, but how they're influencing you. Because they're all influencing all of us all the time. So it's like we're about to dive into the recipe for when you take action and when you don't. And if you understand the recipe and then understand the ingredients inside the recipe, then you can change the ingredients when appropriate. Instead of thinking that these are either yes or no, and they all need to be turned on in order to be motivated and to take action. I think what a lot of people don't understand is that their drivers are influencing them to not take action, while their motivation is influencing them to take action, but their motivation is always going to end. And that's why we've got the yo-yo. That's why we've got this constant conflict inside of us, that we're actually being driven in two different directions. Our ego is driving us one way, but our soul is actually dropping that anchor that you're talking about, because we don't want to go there, you know? And I know we don't want to go there because you're trying to motivate me to go there, which tells me we don't want to go there. So again, the very existence of motivation lets us know we're not going to like this. This is not going to be fun. So let's dive into these drivers a little bit. The first one I said is values. And your values are what's important to you. And what's really critical is that we understand our precise values, not just our general values, right? Like as humans, we are generally driven toward freedom, happiness, fun. But that's a general value, and it doesn't give us enough information to actually manipulate our ingredients, right? So we want precise values, meaning like, what does it actually mean for you to have fun? What does it mean for me to experience freedom? And what it means for me to experience freedom is going to be different than what it means for you to experience freedom. So if we come up with a way to be driven toward freedom, and it's just this one size fits all approach, it might work for you, but not work for me, or vice versa, or it might not work for either one of us until we look at our individual values. Because again, this is about what is this human driven by? And that requires us to look at ourselves under the microscope, which is not fun for a lot of us. You know, the mirror is the scariest thing for a lot of humans. It's the scariest thing for the human ego, is to actually look in the mirror. But without looking in the mirror and studying and really paying attention to us, then we'll never get our precise values. So what's really, truly important to me? A lot of people are motivating themselves to take actions that they don't really want to take to achieve an outcome that they actually don't really want. So is there any wonder why we're not taking actions we don't want to take to produce an outcome we don't want to experience? Because it's actually not all that important to us. So of course we're going to stay unmotivated. But when we recognize that we want a certain thing because it's important to us, it's amazing how a lot of times we will immediately want to take the actions that for the longest time we didn't want to take. Sometimes the shift is immediate because we're seeing the outcome through our values, not through the satisfaction of our ego. Does that make sense the way I'm saying it?
Totally. I was just thinking, I'm trying to use my motivation to lift your anchor, right? Like it's not even my anchor. It's not even attached to my boat. And I'm looking though at my anchor that's not lifting because it's insane. Like it doesn't even have the capacity to work at all. Man, and what did you just say a moment ago, that it was like that it's something about it being like a miserable, like just a not fun experience. But I was thinking, what's the other option? the other thing of the constant like addiction and need for motivation and the like the continual stress of the body, I mean, that doesn't sound, you're talking about the mirror, right? Let me look at that thing for a moment. Let me learn what I need, what really inspires me, not what inspires you, and judging my inspiration based on what works for you, but taking that time to really get to know me, that's worth it. Because the other option is that long, like slow burnout.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bless our hearts.
Bless our hearts. We're all just hot messes doing the best we can, but learning how to uproot other people's anchors and then applying it to ourselves and then getting frustrated that it's not working for us.
Right.
And then we get to beat ourselves up.
And I have a speedboat, and this other
Yeah,
person has a fishing boat. They're not even close to the same boat.
exactly. Yeah. So the second one is beliefs. And my definition of a belief is simply a story with evidence. It's just the stories that we repeat over and over again to the point where we think they're true. We all have beliefs. Some of them are empowering, some of them are disempowering. Some of them serve us, some of them don't serve us. Some of them are healthy, some of them are not. Some of them are protective and some of them are dangerous. But they all essentially work the same way, right? They're just stories that we've told ourselves. So the question to ask is basically, do my stories serve my purpose? And when we ask questions like that, it's not, are my stories right or wrong? It's, do they serve my purpose? And if they don't serve my purpose, even if they're right, quote unquote, right, they have to be changed because they're not serving our purpose, which is obviously going to require that we know what our purpose is. So then we can use the beliefs that we have and simply judge them according to whether they're working or not whether they're right, not whether they are Christian or Catholic or any other form of good or bad based on upbringings that we have, based on programs, not considering how long we've had them. I can't change this story. I've been telling it for 40 years. Okay, is it working? If it's not working, then the best time to change a 40-year story is at the 40-year mark. Otherwise, it's going to be a 41-year story that doesn't work. So we can remove a lot of our emotional attachments to right or wrong, good or bad, should or shouldn't, if we just assess our stories according to whether it's working. Do they serve our purpose or do they not? And if they don't, then they need to change. And that doesn't mean you're dumb. It doesn't mean that you suck. It doesn't mean anything other than the story that's driving you doesn't have the capacity to create the outcome that you want. So without self-judgment, change the story. And belief work is not a quick change, but it's possible. And like you said earlier, it's worth it, to really take a look at what are the beliefs and where did they come from? And what's a better belief that's going to help me achieve the outcome that I want? And how can I start telling that story and be rigorous with that story, because that one is going to, it's going to work. Right? It's going to serve my purpose more. And this next one is related to, they're all related to some degree, But this next one is identities. And that one, the way I teach it and understand it, is kind of underneath beliefs, right? Underneath the beliefs that we have are identities that we are, right? The identities are who we are or who we want to be. Those are our identities. And who we believe we are is going to not just determine some of those beliefs, but it's going to hold on to some of those beliefs that I was just talking about, right? So if you believe yourself to be a loser, it's going to be really hard to listen to stories about you winning. And so a lot of people, going back to this idea of motivation and why it doesn't work for a lot of times, if you motivate yourself with an affirmation or a goal poster or some, habit change that's all about winning and succeeding and I am who I want to be, but underneath that, there's an identity of I'm a loser, the identity is going to win, right? It cancels it out. The identity is going to win because it's more foundational. It's closer to who we are as a person. And over the course of time, it's going to overpower the stories that we tell, right? Which is the belief. So identity work, I know you know this, identity work is incredibly liberating to understand who we really are, who we think we are, who we want to be, and understand that our identities really operate as different personalities, right? It's almost like different actors in a play. The play is our life and the actors are all of our identities. And then we can, again, assess, does this identity serve my purpose? Just like with the beliefs, it's not about, is this identity right or wrong or good or bad, or how long have I had this identity? Does this identity serve my purpose? Knowing that the identity is influencing you, right? If we just close our eyes and pretend that we don't have an identity that we do have, that doesn't make it stop. That doesn't stop its influence on us. It just stops our ability to manipulate it. It stops our ability to do anything about it. So our identities are always working. They're always driving us. The question is, are we aware of them or not? Is there anything you want to add to identity work, which I know has been such a big part of your journey?
Only like an hour worth of content. What you were saying, I mean, one of the things that I've heard you say before is that we don't have any power to change anything that we don't confront, right? That we don't make a choice to look at. And it's,
we can't control what we won't confront.
Right. And if we don't have any control, then there's no power to change.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong or bad. Sean, you said that it's not a right or wrong. It's just understanding that they are operating and they all have their own set of beliefs. So each one of them has their own creator, like they're the creator of their own set of stories and the collector of all of the evidence for that story. And having that awareness that even before anything else, just having that awareness that that's happening, that you can separate who you are, like authentically, like who you truly are, from these beliefs, from these identities, that concept for me, and I hope for anybody that's listening, was so liberating, because then it became like a piece of me. It became like a not
there's
my
separation. There's a positive separation that happens.
Absolutely.
Where it's like you go from being in the movie to in the theater watching the movie, And that positive separation is one of the things that gives us that control that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it lets us know, like, we can actually change some of this stuff.
Right. It's not permanent, like who I am, and I'm just stuck this way with this story. Yeah. It's good stuff.
Yeah, that's a really, really big piece. And who we think we are in terms of our identities is just a function of what we grew up with, right? Like, we don't consciously choose our identities early on in our life. So there's no shame in having them, or there really shouldn't be. But a lot of us do hold on to the shame. And that's one of the reasons why the mirror is so scary, right? We don't want to dive into the shame and the guilt. But if we can remove that, then it's so much easier to go, oh, look at this human being has an identity of this. And that's why they sabotage everything. Or that's why they always hurt somebody before they let other people hurt them. You know, that's why they can't hold on to a relationship. That's why they don't hold on to money, because there's an identity here that's at work, and the motivation won't uproot the identity. So our identities have definitions. That's the fourth one here, is definitions. And there are many, many definitions that we've picked up along the way. Most of our definitions early on in our life were given to us by our parents, by our religion, by our schools, by our sports coaches, by books we read, by some external input. And we have definitions of what's right or wrong. We have definitions of what's good or bad. We have definitions of pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure is more of an internal definition because it's what we've experienced. And those definitions are obviously going to determine our movement, right? We're going to move away from pain and toward pleasure. We're going to move away from wrong and toward right. We're going to move away from bad and toward good. But you and I might have different definitions of what's good and bad. So you might have grown up with the definition of good is when everybody likes you. And I might have grown up with the definition of good as being always in control. So I don't give a damn if everybody likes me. I need to be in control. And you don't give a damn about being in control. You need everybody to like you. So we're both driven toward good, but the definitions differ. And this is really important when it comes to relationships and understanding other people. If your definition of, I'm trying to think of another, like in the context of, let's say business. Let's say you and I are business partners, and your definition of ethical in business is tied to the prices that you charge. And my definition of ethical in business is making the shareholders happy, right? And the shareholders might be internal, might be external in a public company or something like that. So if our definitions of ethical differ, then we're going to have problems. We're both going to be driven toward ethical, but we're actually moving in different directions because the target of ethical is different. And then you and I can get into heated discussions about not being ethical. And we're actually both right according to our definitions, but we're going nowhere. And we can argue about those literally until the end of time, or until the partnership ends, or until we're sick of each other and, you know, and we're going to sabotage it or something. You know, it's going to end at some point unless and until we can recognize, oh, we actually have just defined this differently. You know, in a relationship, most people want connection, but what it means to each person is different, or what humor means, or what sex means, or what loyalty means is different in each relationship, quite often from the different parties. So it's critical for us to understand that we have definitions that usually were first started before we can remember. And if they started before we can remember, it's going to be hard for a lot of us to go, hold on, time out. What's your definition of this thing? Because we don't remember anybody doing that with us. We don't remember saying, I'm choosing to define respect as this. So if we don't recall when a definition started, why would we have the awareness that a definition can change or somebody else can have a different one? So that's the idea of definitions, especially with polarizing concepts like good or bad. I mean, those are two different extremes, right and wrong, should and shouldn't. These are the polarization of our definitions. And again, they're working all the time because this is what we're driven by. And then another thing, the next one here is fears. We're constantly driven by fears, but again, of what? Fear of what? And I think when it comes to personal development and moving toward our purpose in life, the main distinction that is really helpful for us to have awareness on is whether we're driven by the fear of failure or the fear of regret. Those are the two main driving fears. And remember, driven by doesn't necessarily mean motivated by, right? So when you're driven by the fear of failure, that doesn't mean that you lean into failure. It means you go away from failure. You're driven in the opposite direction of failure. The problem with that is every action has the potential for failure. So if you're driven away from the experience of failure, that means you're going to be by default driven away from taking action, which means you're going to need to be motivated to take the actions toward the failure because you're trying to overcome the failure, or you're going to have to motivate yourself to pick yourself back up after the failure, right? So wherever the fear lies, we're going to be by default driven away from it. So when we're driven by the fear of failure, we're driven away from failure, we're going to constantly have to motivate ourselves into taking action. But when we're driven by the fear of regret, see, regret happens when we don't do things and we never know what we're made of. We never know if we can actually accomplish something, right? We never write the book. We never take the action. We never ask the person out on a date. That's the fear that the soul is actually driven by. The mind is driven by failure because we have this construct because of our ego of what it means to fail. It means that we are a failure. The soul is driven by not wanting to regret life. Not, at the end of our life, we're going to ask ourselves, not what did we accomplish and what did we not accomplish, but did we live while we were alive? And that's a regret conversation. Did we try? Did we give the effort? And we will be much more regretful of the things we didn't try than we are going to be shameful of the things we tried and failed. But in the moment, most of us are more afraid of the failure. So if we're driven by regret, then that means we're going to be driven away from regret. And the beautiful thing there is that means our default is action. I really want this to land. If we're more afraid of failure, then our default will be not taking action. If we're more afraid of regret, then our default will be action. And when our default is action, now we don't need motivation to act because we're being driven by the fear of regret and action is already being taken. And now our journey is, how do we manipulate that action? How do we course correct when necessary? Rather than having to motivate yourself just to that point where you take action. But then what happens when you do fail? And you will fail. And now we got to motivate ourselves again. And that's where so much of this exhaustion, really comes in. So if we understand that fear is really a mechanism of protection and preservation, right? We want to preserve our identities and we want to protect ourselves from the fear that's driving us. The question is, are you going to protect yourself from the fear of failure, or are you going to protect yourself from the fear of regret? Regret works better. Long term, people being fueled by the fear of regret is much more sustainable and inspiring than people being fueled by the fear of failure. Got anything to add to that before we talk about these last two? Only another hour and a half of content?
Right. Let me be careful with what I say. It just puts us back in that ego room, right? With the temporary rocket booster trying to simply overcome the fear versus moving forward, right? It's that forward, it's a pull, right? It's a pull toward our purpose instead of needing something to push us away from the thing that we don't want. And it's so much easier and more sustainable to be pulled. And it feels, at least for me, it feels better than to constantly need something coming up behind me, pushing me.
Yeah. And the idea of overcoming fear, just the concept of overcoming fear is a misunderstanding of the way the human brain works, because we'll never not have fears. So this is not about overcoming fears. It's about being driven by the fears that do exist. And we don't have to change the fear of regret. We shouldn't change the fear of regret. That's a really good fear, actually, because it drives us toward our purpose. So again, the question is, does it serve us? The fear of regret serves us if we allow that to fuel us. Now, the thing about these two polarized fears is that we all have both of them. It's like there are two channels in our fear experience. The question is, which one are you paying attention to? Which one are you looking at? Which one are you listening to? We always have the fear of failure. Now, we might not define failure the same way. This goes back to definitions, right? We might not define failure the same way, but we all are afraid of failure. All of us. My identities or the way that I've been brought up might allow me to not define making phone calls and get nobody to say yes as failure. So then I keep going and going and going, whereas you might define failure as making a phone call and people don't even answer. If that's failure to you, well, it's going to be hard to make the phone calls, but it might not be failure to me. So I still might be afraid of failure, but it's not defined as people saying no. But I'm afraid of failure still. And if my idea of failure actually includes regret, meaning failure is living this life and not ever knowing what I'm capable of, now I can use it in a positive sense, meaning that it's going to drive me toward taking action, right? So there's two more things here on the list, and one of them is a little bit more surface level. Number 6 is habits. We're driven by habits because, as we talk about, we hear this phrase a lot, we're creatures of habit, which is true. Our unconscious mind actually is driven toward familiar, is driven by familiar. So whatever we habitually do is familiar to us. And it's easy to fall back onto habits. It's like just following the path that's already paved rather than having to pave another path. So it's easier to walk on the paved path. So let's just do the thing that we've always done. And one of the things that's really important to understand about habits is habits are formed through consistency, not intensity. If our habits require emotional motivation, they're probably not actually habits. They're just something that we can do when we're motivated. But that's not a habit. A habit is something that we actually default toward. So a habit is something that works like clockwork, right? It's not something that we need to feel like doing. It's something that we just do. And then again, the question is, do our habits serve our purpose? Does our habit lead us to the thing that we want or the way that we want to feel? And we all have habits. They're neither good nor bad. They just are. They're driving us in a certain direction. And our awareness leads us to what direction are they driving us in. And we have habits that are a function of the way we've been brought up. They're not shameful or guilt-ridden. If we have a habit that we don't like, we can change the habit, just like with beliefs, right? So we shouldn't attach ourselves emotionally or attach our identities or attach whether we're a good person or not to our habits, because that kind of emotional attachment actually doesn't help us change our habits. And so when we identify that we have a habit that's pulling us in one direction, we don't want to go to that direction, then we need to shift the habit. And it's really just that simple. Now, it takes a while to do it. It's not just a flip of a switch. But again, it's possible. The last thing here that I want to talk about is a little bit deeper in concept. And it's experiences, but the embodiment of experiences, right? We all have experiences. Some of us have things that happened to us in our childhood that we wish wouldn't have happened to us, or we're glad happened to us, right? Again, not right or wrong, good or bad. It just is. What a lot of us don't understand, though, this is something that I didn't learn until just maybe a few years ago. And I've been in personal development for a long, long time. I didn't know how influential our embodied experiences are, how much they actually drive us, right? Motivation is intellectual by nature, driven by our ego and so forth that we've been talking about. But our experiences are embodied. They're neurological. So if we, let's say that we experience abuse in our childhood, that abuse is in our body. It's not just in our mind. It's in our body. And so a lot of people might physically tighten up when they hear a loud voice, because once upon a time, loud voice meant you're in trouble and you're about to get hit. And if you grow up in your adult years and you do some work around motivation, let's say, and you learn how to change your mindset and you learn how to try to overcome the obstacles that are in front of you, but your body actually never gets healed, then you're always going to have this triggered response at a neurological level. It's literally in our bodies. And so this happens a lot with people that are afraid of like speaking, let's say, afraid of visibility or afraid of doing videos. A lot of people will motivate themselves. They'll learn what to say and what not to say. They'll learn all the rules. They'll learn how to create videos or how to speak on stage or something. But then when they go to do the thing, their body reacts and says, I don't want to. Because visibility is actually dangerous. Visibility is scary. If they can see me, they can hurt me. If they can't see me, they can't hurt me. And that's such an elementary belief, because that's where it was learned, at an elementary level, at a very immature level early on in our life. And if we don't ever deal with that, you can learn all the rules of speaking, and your body will not want to be visible. And this is actually the reason that a lot of people, most people, are afraid of speaking. It's an embodied fear of visibility. It's not an intellectual lacking of capability. It's not going to be solved by skills. It's not going to be solved by information because the body is responding. So our embodied experiences actually drive us more than our intellectual awareness, than our knowledge. And there's a lot of studies now with neuroscience and embodied traumas and so forth that says our body decides what to do faster than our mind does, because our body's reaction based on the experiences from our past, it's an immediate choice. And that choice is based on what we've done in the past. And then a lot of times we repeat what we've always done in the past. And then that becomes a habit, right? That's, how habits and embodied experiences can work with each other. So our embodied experiences need to be paid attention to. And this is why so many people are frustrated, because they do all of this work around motivation. They do all this work around intellect. They do all this work around information. And their body doesn't want to. It's that simple. And it's very difficult, if possible at all, to control our embodied experiences intellectually. Because our embodied experience is just more powerful. So a lot of us are literally, we all are. We all are literally operating according to, or being driven by, to keep it on point here, this conversation, we're being driven by instinctual responses from our body. And if that doesn't get attention, especially if we don't know what's happening, we can't give attention to something we're not aware of. If that doesn't get attention, then our bodies can keep that anchor firmly planted. And this really is an exact example of the anchor metaphor that you were talking about. Many of us have an embodied anchor, but we've got intellectual capacity. And the embodied anchor will always win. And then we get frustrated because we did all the things right. We get motivated. We actually feel like doing it. But our body wins. Our body will always win, because that driver is so much deeper. And I've been really focused a lot lately over the last few years since I learned this. And I did a lot of my own somatic work, somatic meaning in the body. I've done a lot of my own somatic work and awareness, and uprooted a lot of these anchors that I didn't even know were there. And the level of liberation when we do that work is literally unimaginable. It's literally incomprehensible, because it's our intellect that does the comprehending. And our intellect can't really understand what's going on at an embodied, deep level. And we all have traumas. We all have micro traumas. We all have macro traumas. For most of us, micro traumas never get looked at, because those are the little tiny things that just kind of go under the radar. But a collection of micro traumas is actually more powerful than a smaller collection of macro traumas, meaning that somebody might have, going back to the abuse example, somebody might have an abuse experience in their past. And I'm not trying to trivialize any of this stuff, just kind of use it in context of an example here. Somebody might have abuse in their past, and that's the macro trauma. And they might get therapy around that, and they might actually do a lot of work around their macro trauma, but they don't recognize that over the course of their entire life, there's a micro trauma maybe of different being bad, right? Like, you know, we go through school and we're ridiculed or we're laughed at because we're different. And so this macro trauma of abuse, even if it's healed, might actually not be as significant as the collection of micro traumas around being different, or micro traumas around uncertainty, right? Uncertainty is scary. You know, if I don't know what's going to happen, then, you know, bad things happen. Or micro traumas around money. Every time I have money, something bad happens. Or micro traumas around our weight, right? This collection of micro traumas is actually a bigger danger most of the time to most people than the macro traumas that we're aware of. Man, that was a good chunk of 45 minutes or however long that was of really understanding not motivation, but drive. And we're driven by all of these things. None of us is missing any one of those things. We all have all of them, and they're always influencing us all the time. The only variable is, do we know about it? And then if we know about it, are we going to do anything about it if our drivers are actually not leading us to what we want to experience in life? And the more neutral we can be, rather than getting our feelings involved and whether it hurts or not to admit something and whether it's shameful or not, the more neutral we can be and go, wow, I have these influences. I have these drivers and they're actually pulling me off course. So let me do the work that I need to do in order to pull them back on course and go where I want to go in life. And the cool thing about that, Michelle, is we all already have drivers that are designed to take us where we want to go. We just need to uproot the drivers that we've learned along the way. So the drivers that are pulling us away from our purpose are actually constructed drivers. They're the things that we've learned. Those are not natural drivers. So much of this work, as you know, is about removing the negative influences. It's about uprooting that anchor. It's about removing the influence of the parking brake so that we can do the work that our soul wants to do, so that we can go the direction that our soul already wants to go. And to me, that's really important to understand. And hopefully it's hopeful for people. Hopefully it's inspiring for people that this is not anything that any of us don't have. This is just something that most of us don't do. Every single one of us can remove the drivers that are pulling us away from our purpose and tap into the drivers that are naturally going to pull us toward our purpose. It's just most of us either don't know that it's possible, or we talk ourselves out of it because we think it's painful. But it's worth it. Well, thank you for this
amazing conversation.
Invigorating conversation. If there's anything that any of you that are listening or watching, you know, want to add, ask, or if you just want support, you know, we don't have the ability to become aware of these things. You know, these are in our blind spots for the most part. And it doesn't matter if we're really good coaches, right? The two of us are pretty good coaches. We can't coach ourselves. And we've each coached each other actually around a lot of these things, because we have to be guided into seeing the things that we're not currently seeing. So if any of you do want support on any of this stuff, then please sign up for a free consultation. It's one of the things that our company offers, is a free consultation, and you can ask us anything and you can bring whatever you want to the table. and we'll do everything that we can to help you identify some of the things that might be a parking brake for you or might be a deeply embedded anchor for you that we can help uproot. So with that, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate your guidance along this conversation. And I know we'll probably be doing this many more times in the future. And hopefully for all of you listening, it's been valuable. If it's been disruptive and irritating, that's actually good, right? If you found yourself getting angry even, that's good. That's actually a sign that something is getting stirred up inside of you that needs to be addressed. And if we don't confront it, we can't control it. So the question is, do you want to be in control of your drivers, or do you want your drivers to constantly be in control of you? Now, if you like this video, take a look at that one where I talk about the critical mindset you need to succeed as a coach, especially when it comes to where to spend your time and your energy. We're all putting our time and energy somewhere, but the reality is most of us are not getting the results that we want. So this conversation is a little bit of a tough love, cold, hard look at why that is.